What's that? We're going to be starting the geologic record today. So welcome again. We are starting our next section. As mentioned, we're going to be looking at the geologic record today. Just a quick review of where we've been. These bottom four foundational steps here. These were the theories, the ideas, the philosophies that surround the foundation of naturalism. The idea that you don't need God to account for anything in the world. You know, supposedly there was this big bang and life came from non-life. The genetic code coded for itself, and through natural selection, we have everything that we see in the world today in terms of living things. So those are the ideas. Now we've begun taking a look at the physical evidence. The previous chapter, we looked at the fossil record, and what we found when we examined the fossil record is that when we look at these fossils, they don't look like the millions and billions of years old that they supposedly are. You know, we look at these dinosaur fossils, they have all these characteristics that they can only have if they're way younger than that. So we're going to continue our journey, and right now that means the geologic record. So make sure to write down geologic record. You making that up right now? Okay. All right, so continuing on, let's wrap up the conversations, folks. Here we go. The geologic record. We got a brand new wallpaper up now, and we're going to go forward. The scientist who is responsible for the quotes that are unattributed in this section go to this guy, Dr. Taz Walker. He actually has his PhD in mechanical engineering. His interest in earth science and geology, though, led him to go back to school to get formally trained in that stuff. And he continues to put out lots of good research surrounding those different things. So when we talk about the fossil record and the geologic record here, they go hand in hand. And that's why we do this right after the fossil record. Because when we look at fossils, they're not just sitting out in the open view of everybody. Fossils that we find in the fossil record are found in the geologic layers of the geologic record. So they go hand in hand. Now, when we say record, that's a very misleading thing because it kind of assumes that rocks and fossils are ordered and they can be read like a historical document. And it gives geological interpretations priority over ancient documents of folks that actually saw these things in person. You know, in science, we have become comfortable with our methodology of dating these things based on the millions and millions of years old assumptions, despite the fact that we have geological things, despite the fact that we have ancient documents that document dinosaurs and just show completely accurate depictions of these creatures and demonstrate that they're not millions of years old. So we believe this in spite of the eyewitness accounts that we have so many of from past civilizations. And that goes both with the fossil record and the geologic record. Yes. The way this plays into the geologic record is, of course, as Bible-believing Christians, we would say that the geologic record was laid down as a result of Noah's flood. Now, that would just be thought of as fiction by the scientific community today, even though there are records of global floods from cultures in, like, I think it's over 300 ancient cultures have records of a worldwide flood when you look at all the different ancient histories. So whether you're looking at the geologic record or the fossil record, we've got eyewitness accounts of things that match exactly with what we see in Scripture. And yet the scientific community chooses to close their eyes to these eyewitness accounts. And that's very, very sad. All right. Got some quotes here for you. Because the setup, again, is that if you would say to a scientist that the geologic record was laid down as a result of Noah's flood, they're going to laugh at you. So what kind of world do we exist in terms of geology today? Well, we exist in a world where everybody says these layers were laid down over hundreds of millions of years. And over that period of time, you got all those layers. So let's just read a couple quotes here from Dr. Walker and see where we stand. But rocks and fossils cannot be read like a book. The so-called histories that are derived from this evidence are based upon pre-existing assumptions that are brought to bear when interpreting the layers. It may come as a surprise to some, but the rocks are often described as ambiguous because they can support multiple interpretations. Geologists are well aware of this, and many find it amusing to see their colleagues argue different scenarios about the past while observing the exact same outcrop. Darwin, who was primarily a geologist early on, built his theory of evolution squarely on then-current theories of geology, because it was the geology world that threw these millions and billions of years into the Earth's supposed history, and that's why the theory of evolution was able to take hold, because they thought they had all these years to work with. The so-called geologic record has given the historical sciences an Earth history of billions of years that allows unobservable biological evolution to seem plausible. And it continues. During these years of training, I, Dr. Walker, realized that contrary to popular belief, the eons of time provided by geology are not based upon discoveries that geologists make, but flow out of assumptions that were accepted within the discipline over 150 years ago. In Darwin's time, these assumptions seemed plausible, they were culturally attractive, and they did work in some situations, especially with the data that was available back then. However, our geological understanding of the Earth has increased 1,000-fold and more since then. It is rapidly becoming apparent that uniformitarian assumptions do not match the geological observations. We'll talk more about this term, uniformitarianism, in a little while. And then to close this out, a fundamental reevaluation of historical geology is necessary. However, this is such a daunting task that the geological establishment has been unwilling to face the upheaval. The corporate responses of the various professional geological societies have been to censor discussion and issue policy statements meant to marginalize alternative views. But the evidence is accumulating, and it is becoming clear that there is a problem. It does not seem possible that geologists can avoid it forever. In the exact same way that when we look at the fossil record, in the exact same way that in that interview with Dr. Schweitzer, when she was interviewed for 60 Minutes, the one thing they never questioned was the age of those fossils. Instead of doing the sane thing and being like, whoa, these fossils don't look billions of years old. They must not be. Instead of saying that, they say, wow, I wonder what magical things could be at work to preserve these bones for so long. And that's the fundamental flaw in the scientific community today. To believe that these billions of years are there and not questioning them really blinds them to the facts that are right in front of their face. But it wasn't always this way. The scientific community, by and large, came from an assumption of biblical history. If you go to the 1700s and previous to that, if you were a scientist, you believed the biblical version of history all the way through, 6,000 years and everything in between. And this is one of those individuals that had a big impact on the geological scientists. Nicholas Steno, 1638 to 1686, considered the father of modern geology. He wrote Prodromus, and a lot of what he figured out for the first time is still taught in geology classes today. And he was the first person to really publish an explanation for the mystery of strange solid objects that were found within rocks that today we call fossils. He correctly attributed them to Noah's flood, and that was seen as a plausible way to explain them. And it's not just that individual. Every single scientist that really contributed to the sciences that you study in high school here, whether it's biology or chemistry or physics or astronomy or anatomy or any of the others. They were biblical creationists. Isaac Newton, probably the greatest scientist of all time. You got Kepler, Burnett, Whiston, Morrow, Hooke, and Woodward, a couple other ones. You remember we talked about Mendel and his stuff with population genetics, a creation scientist, and many, many others. And this period of time in the 1600s, that's really when the foundations of the science that we learn about today as a foundation of your curriculum, that's when that was come up with. It wasn't as a result of evolution. That came much later. So to these geological pioneers, the rocks did not demand a history extending for unimaginable eons of time. Rather, they spoke of rapid catastrophism and were seen as consistent with the history of the Bible. And finally, you get to write something down. Go ahead and write this down, please. The whole thing.
Stop smashing.
Writing down the slide here.
Okay, is that the first one?
Yep. You know, a lot of times we hear about the Enlightenment as this period of time, by the word itself, when we just stopped being superstitious and we started using things like the scientific method and actually began doing good science. Well, people were doing good science way before the Enlightenment. The main change that happened at the Enlightenment is people stopped using the history of the Bible in their considerations for how things got here. And they wanted to just discover things from nature and reason alone without any biblical history. And this was a reaction to lots of different things. Christians hold some of the blame for this because, again, before this period of time in the 1700s, all respectable scientists were really Christians. And so, because of that, if you are a scientist and you are a Christian and you come up with a theory, well, maybe you think the Bible sort of supports that. And if you can connect your theory to the Bible, then that gives your idea a lot more weight in that scientific community. It turned out that most often people were reading too much into the Bible. They were making it say things that it didn't really say, and people got tired of this. So Christian scientists were misusing the Bible every so often. Not all of them. It happened enough that people got sick of it. Also, the invoking of miracles to explain natural things. You know, one of the examples of this, I guess, is how people used to think that angels were pushing the planets around the sun and the moon around the earth. Well, you don't need angels. You just need Isaac Newton to come along to explain to you how this stuff really works. In other words, don't go to the supernatural unless you have to. Yes, God created everything supernaturally, but he sustains things through natural laws. That's why we can actually do science. And in fact, that's the reason science really got started. Because if God is an organized creator that made all this for our benefit, for us, then surely he has some organized laws that continue to sustain it. And it was because of that that we realized that we can do science. We can make predictions. We can come up with theories. The rise of naturalism as a worldview was another thing that really went against biblical ideology. Naturalism, again, the idea that you don't need supernatural things to explain stuff or how things got here. And finally, a desire for a brand new way of looking at things. By this time, you know, explaining things through the biblical lens, as good as it was and as predictive as it was, and it really explained things in a good way. But people just got tired of it. They got bored with it. And so when you have all these things happening at once, it really drove that ideology away from a Christian worldview more to that naturalistic perspective that we hear about today. The idea was that we should clear our minds of old beliefs, begin with a clean slate, give new ideas a fair chance. The problem was that the Bible was simply thrown out without a proper evaluation. On the surface, a purely deductive approach seems reasonable. After all, if the Bible is true, should not deductive reasoning reveal evidence for things like Noah's flood? What is often missed, however, is that it is impossible to separate theory, presupposition, and assumption from models of geological history. When the tide turned during the Enlightenment, this was conveniently swept under the rug. Please write down the stuff that's underlined. And again, when we're talking about the geologic record here, We're talking about the rock record. You can see these for yourself any place there's a big enough gash in the landscape. The biggest example would be Grand Canyon. If you go there, you can see all those different rock layers. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about geology here, these rock layers. So when we start discussing how people tried to explain how everything got here without God, without a Christian lens to interpret the data with, the first person to try to do that formally was this guy right here, James Hutton. And he wrote this book, Theory of the Earth. Catastrophes are not needed to explain geologic features. That was his idea. And uniformitarianism is the philosophy, and you're going to write down exactly what that is in the next slide. Because even though James Hutton was the first person to formally say that, it wasn't until this guy, Charles Lyell, came along that that idea became popular. Write down the title and then the bottom 3 bullet points. You don't even need his name. So just uniformitarianism and the last 3 bullet points right here. Last 3. So again, Lyell was not the first person to come up with these ideas, but he's really the first person whose name gets attached to these ideas because he was very, very good at selling those thoughts to the scientific community. That's where his skills as a lawyer came in. He was a master of persuasion here. And in the end, as you know, it won the day over the folks who believed the Bible and viewed the world through that lens, unfortunately. But yeah, when we're talking about uniformitarianism, it means that we can only use what is happening geologically on Earth now to explain things, and that given enough time, what we see happening in front of us right now are sufficient to explain all the geological features that we see in front of us, whether it's the Grand Canyon, whether it's Mount Everest, or anything in between. Catastrophic events are not allowed for this. From this philosophy, they would certainly not allow something like Noah's flood, despite the fact that it really accurately describes how all these big geological formations got here. Battery must be running low. There we go. So this was the famous book that he wrote, and it sold very well. Scientific community really took it on for themselves. And the purpose of the book was not about giving any new observations. We had seen all the observations we need to see from the geologic record to this point. It was about providing an interpretive framework, a way of explaining that information. So no new information was here. It was just about persuading people to that point of view. And he wrote to one of his colleagues, his goal was to free the science of geology from Moses. In other words, he thinks that the Bible was holding science back. So you're going to write this one down too. This is kind of the official definition of uniformitarianism right here. So basically, the philosophy of uniformitarianism is something where the scientific community handicaps itself, because they're only willing to look at the geological things happening today when they try and explain how everything we see in the world got here. They're not allowing themselves to even consider the idea that there might be some catastrophes that formed them instead. And it's all kind of summed up in this cheeky little phrase, the present is the key to the past. And it sounds, sounds like one of those statements that's just, how could that not be true? But, just because you see things happening in the world today does not mean they've always been happening that way. Because you can't go back in time and observe that these things have been occurring over these vast amounts of time. So then the question is, what's a better explanation? Catastrophes or things that have been going on for millions and billions of years? And a lot of what we're going to see going forward is that comparison. But yeah, the present is the key to the past. It's a fun little saying. It means uniformitarianism. Now, if we want to get specific here, the geological community has now changed their stance because they actually do acknowledge that some catastrophes are necessary to explain things, but they'll never go so far to say that something like Noah's flood happened, because that's just too Christian, that's too biblical. We can't quite go that far. But just like in the other chapters, they are, because science is pointing in this one direction, they're forced to step in the direction of biblical history. And that's very telling. So Lyell's philosophy has three main strands here. And what we're going to talk about over the next probably half hour of class time or so, maybe 20, 25 minutes, I'm going to carry into tomorrow, of course, is this first one. So what I'd like you to write down here is the bullet point. Lyell's philosophy has three main strands. And then write down what you see written here in number 1. Also put underlines under that, because it's going to be kind of the title to the next bunch of things that we talk about in the notes. So this is like a special section of our notes, starting here. You're writing down the first bullet point and then the underlined stuff in number 1. And this is kind of your title for what's going to follow here for the next 15, 20 minutes of class. Maybe a half hour, we'll see. So again, Lyell wanted to free science from Moses. So you got to do that in a lot of different ways. Number 1, he needed to emphasize geological features that would demand these millions and billions of years of time to happen. Because if the Bible says the world's 6,000 years old, one way you can disprove that is by pointing out things in the world that would need longer than that period of time to happen. And so this is what he first wanted to emphasize in his published work. We're going to get into that shortly here. Again, you're not writing down all these, just the bullet point and then the one underlined thing. So the first thing we're going to discuss on this is process of fossilization. Lyell believed it demanded millions of years of time to happen. The idea, again, is that you've got these dinosaurs, they die, they get covered by a lake or something somehow, and then over time you got more layers of sediment building up until they're excavated by a bunch of happy archaeologists. So typically you would see this type of a description. A fish dies and sinks to the bottom of a lake. That fish rots. It's got bones that are just left. All the skin and muscle and stuff is gone. Then over millions of years, the mud turns to rock. And over time, that bone matter is changed into mineral matter. So again, it's a cute story, but those millions of years cannot be true. The process of fossilization has to happen extremely fast. Both the sedimentation process, where it's covered quickly by sediment, and the mineralization process. Otherwise, those bones are going to be completely gone over just, maybe a period of 100 years at best. At best. So, that's a cute story, but it doesn't happen this way. Geologists now acknowledge that fossilization only happens under abnormal, catastrophic conditions. So once again, we're seeing the scientific community slowly step in the right direction. So at least that's encouraging to us. Go ahead and write down fossils, and then the bottom 2 bullet points. They're probably the fossils that show the best evidence of this. And these are the jellyfish fossils that were found in Wisconsin. There's no way those are going to take millions of years to fossilize. It has to happen extremely fast.
Just the first 2 bullet points?
Bottom 2. Title, and then these 2 bullet points down here.
All 3?
No. You're writing down the title and then the bottom 2 bullet points. So yeah, fossilization is a process that has to happen fast. Not just the mineralization process itself, but the sedimentation process as well. These animals have to be covered extremely fast so there's no scavenging. They have to permineralize very fast so that you actually have something like a fossilized jellyfish. Other pieces of evidence show that this had to happen quickly too. When we uncover a lot of these dinosaur remains, they are in exceptionally good condition. And they can't be in exceptionally good condition unless this happens extremely quickly. So there's no scavenging whatsoever in many examples. Excellent preservation. Even flipper bones are seen intact in some of these creatures. And it points to an extremely fast watery catastrophe that caused these animals to become fossilized.